Good morning and hello again. Today I wanted to talk to you about St.Turibius of Mogrovejo, who was the second Archbishop of Lima in Peru. I wanted to talk to you about him because I think he's a good model not only for bishops and priests, but for all of us as to how we can be missionaries, just as God calls us and just where God sends us, even amidst this crisis of the coronavirus. St.Turibius was a layman. He studied law at Salamanca. He was a renowned jurist, and he even had to work for what was then called the Holy Inquisition. He was so successful in law and so renowned and revered for his intellectual prowess that he caught the eye of many ecclesiastics. But he was a layman, and he was a committed layman. He went to church. He performed his spiritual exercises. He was truly devout. He understood that Christ had called him to a deeper commitment. And so he was a model disciple, especially in the legal profession. But when the Archbishop of Lima died, they needed a new archbishop, and they wanted someone who would be a good jurist, because Lima at that time was growing, and there were many disputes that had to be solved, especially with the indigenous peoples. And so at first, he tried to cite all the different laws that would keep him and prevent him from being nominated to be a bishop. In fact, he was still only one of the baptized. He had not received any of the minor orders or been ordained a deacon or a priest. But nevertheless, the ecclesiastical officials, including the Pope, insisted that he should go. And so finally he accepted. And when he accepted, he wrote something that might be translated like this. While the weight of this exceeds my strength, it would be terrible even for the angels. And despite seeing myself unworthy of such a high position, I did not decline, but rather accepted, trusting in the Lord and throwing all my worries and concerns on him. God calls each of us by name. He calls us to do things that we never thought we could do, and we can do them by his grace. But I think the first thing that St. Turibius teaches us is the disposition with which we must say yes to God. I did not decline, but rather accepted, trusting in the Lord and throwing all my worries and concerns on him. As we continue our journey together, we need to trust in the Lord, throwing our worries and concerns upon him. Pope Francis constantly is asking us, what type of church do we want to be? Do we want to be a self-referential church or a church that goes forth, a missionary church, one that goes to the spiritual and existential peripheries? God is calling us to be missionaries. And certainly St. Turibius was sent as a missionary far from his native land of Spain to Peru. He submitted to being ordained to the minor orders and then deacon, priest, and bishop in 1580, and then he went to Peru, finally arriving there in 1581. When he first arrived, he arrived in a small town called Paita, which was 600 miles from Lima, and he journeyed on foot all the way to Lima to finally take possession of his diocese in 1581. Walking on foot, he got to know the people around him. You yourselves know the people of our parish. You know the people who live in your neighborhoods. You know them. You know their needs. And I am gradually coming to know their needs through you, through phone calls, through emails, just by being here in Montfort Heights, here at St. Ignatius. We need to know one another and know not only the material needs of people, but even their spiritual and emotional needs. One of the things that Turibius easily identified by listening to his people was that there was a need for the reform of the clergy. That need remains with us here. Obviously, our seminary has gotten a lot better. The new priests being produced are much more evangelical in their outlook, but still there's a continual need for personal conversion. There was a need at that time to build seminaries, and certainly Turibius set his mind to building a seminary, but also not just a building, but to forming the new priests after the heart of Jesus, to form them to be missionaries, to go out, especially to the indigenous people. And so he set his mind, his whole mindset was to be missionary. And we too then need to say, well, how can I be, first, like Turibius, a good disciple, Second, how can I reform my life, just like he wanted to reform the seminary, reform the clergy? And that requires penance and a deep commitment to personal conversion, to deeper conversion to Christ every day, to letting the cross come into our life, as painful as that might be at times, letting something die so that something better can live and grow. But then Turibius also wanted to have some type of outreach, especially to the indigenous peoples. And so he went about catechizing and evangelizing. And he even translated the catechism into local languages to teach the people. His whole mindset was to be a missionary. How is God calling you to be a missionary under these circumstances? Within your own home, within your neighborhoods, to use the new social media as necessary, or to witness to God's love right where he has placed you. We are first disciples, and then we are missionaries. And so Pope Francis says we can be missionary disciples. But that means we need to be well-formed. We need to think about what is our mission and what are we going to tell people. God has given us this opportunity of extra time to study our faith from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, or many resources that are available online, to know it better, to develop our own spiritual life, praying devotions like the Rosary and the Stations of the Cross, things like that, so that we can go forth and share this good news with others. Turibius also had a great challenge because the indigenous people were suffering greatly under the hands of what were called the corregidores. These were men who were like the equivalent of local mayors. They held the funds that were to be used to provide for the material well-being of their people, including the indigenous people. But typically they kept all the money for themselves. God calls us to share our gifts with others. And already this crisis is having a huge economic impact. How are we concerned not only with the material well-being of others and those around us in our neighborhoods, but also their spiritual well-being? Although Turibius was concerned that many of the indigenous people still practiced their indigenous religion, he thought that the way the indigenous people were treated by the Christians, who held all the money and didn't meet their material needs, was even worse. And he chastised them for this. He said, Christ called himself the truth, not the custom, because the local mayors had said, well, it's the custom for us to keep the money for ourselves. And so Turibius brought about a reform not only of the clergy, but even of civic society by insisting that the gospel penetrate every level of human life. And he formed priests in order to go out to teach, to baptize, to catechize. And he defended the rights of the indigenous people. There may come a time where, under a crisis like this, there may be scarcity of resources. Financial resources are one thing, medical resources are another. I want to place before you the idea of thinking about and discerning how would medical resources be allocated? And not only how would they be, but how should they be in light of the dignity of each and every person? Turibius was concerned about the dignity of the indigenous persons. What about the elderly? What about the sick? What are their rights? Are they not, like you and me, made also in the image and likeness of God? Is it not our duty as Catholics to defend the poorest of the poor and the weakest of the weak? Certainly we do that as a Catholic Church with unborn children. But what about those who are poor or sick, elderly, or at the end of life? I certainly hope that they are not simply pushed to the margins or sacrificed, if you will. I don't want to scare anyone, but I just want you to think about that. What are the demands of human dignity in this case? I've been talking to you about a saint who he died in 1606, I think, and lived in Peru, which seems very far from us. But why? Because he was committed to being a disciple, committed to being a missionary, committed to holiness. And he led the Church of Lima in that way. It's interesting that he lived at the same time as St. Rose and St. Martin de Porres, and St. Francis Solanus. The whole city became a community of saints. And that's what we want to be, a parish of saints. We are part of a larger church. We have the Universal Church. We believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Then we have our particular church, the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. We have our parish church, St. Ignatius of Loyola. And still, we could speak of the domestic church, each and every family. I don't know how much longer we'll be able to have our churches open. I don't know how much longer we will not be having public celebrations of Mass. But your families are very important. The domestic churches, they make up our parish, they make up our archdiocese and the universal church. You're in the family. The family, the church teaches, is the building block of society, the first cell of society. I think I have a doctorate in theology, but I think I learned more from my parents about what it means to be holy and what religion is all about from them before I ever went to school. I think I learned it on my knees, praying the rosary as a family, seeing how my mother, with tenderness, ironed our clothes and put them on our chairs, how she made our lunches and wrote our names on them, how she would pray before the crucifix. So we had this 3D image of Jesus on the cross with his eyes open at one angle and his eyes closed in death at another, and how she would weep, singing O Sacred Head Surrounded before that picture. How my father would come back from his rounds at the hospital and take us down one by one into the basement and teach us our catechism from the Baltimore Catechism. God is giving you an opportunity to be together as a family and to pray together as a family. We pray the rosary every night as a family, along with other devotions like the Litany of Loretto, the Angelus, a perpetual novena to the Little Flower. And my parents led us. I know that many of you are finding great difficulty being at home. Some of you are now permanently homeschooling, or at least temporarily homeschooling. You have an appreciation for homeschooling mothers. Certainly, I hope you have an appreciation for our Catholic school and public school teachers. Teaching is very difficult. Disciplining children is difficult. Loving children is difficult. Working from home while trying to do it is difficult. But previous generations have done it. St. Paul says, I can do all things in him who strengthens me. And so at the center of your domestic church must be the person of Jesus Christ. He is the center of our life. He certainly was the center of the life of St.Turibius. And I hope that your domestic churches might flourish and grow. Sometimes we are so busy with life, with sports, with politics, with all kinds of things, with television, wasting time. And now God gives us this gift of time to explore our faith more deeply, to be better disciples, to undertake a commitment, to be a missionary, to be aware of the dignity of each and every person, and to grow in faith. Certainly, I hope that this is a blessed time for you. Certainly, Lent is a sacred season, and I look forward to seeing you in church in the near future when we can together celebrate the Lord's resurrection. Until then, let us think of St.Turibius and his little community of holiness, and may our families be truly holy this day and every day. May God bless you. Bye-bye.